Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do a video that I'm sure is going to get smashed by YouTube, but it got sent to me on Discord and it's something I'm pretty interested in actually learning about. It's why 95% of Denmark's Jews survived. Um, and I'm going to go ahead and jump into it. Just so everybody knows, the reason I've been basically wholly inactive the last couple of weeks, we just bought a house and are in the process of renovating it. I'll throw a couple of pictures in here. Um, but yeah, it's been a super long and crazy process with a ton of different moving parts and all this stuff going on. But everything should be done next Tuesday, Wednesday, somewhere around there. That's when the last of the contractors get done. And so hopefully, everything will be good. We move in at the beginning of August and it'll all be smooth sailing from there. But that's why I haven't been on here much, but I'm going to try to make an effort to get out of the house and put work aside for a little bit every day and try to get back on top of making videos. But with all that being said, let's jump into it.
It was the evening of October 1st, 1943, when German police and members of the Danish SS descended on Copenhagen with orders to round up and deport Denmark's Jewish population. It was the night of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and the German police were expecting to find Jewish families at home celebrating. What they found instead was empty house after empty house. Someone had tipped off the Jewish community. By the end of the war, over 95% of Denmark's nearly 8,000 Jews would escape Denmark and avoid becoming victims of the Holocaust. This survival rate is extraordinary. Unfortunately, this was not the case across the rest of Nazi-occupied Europe. To find out why, we need to go back to 1940. 6 months into the Second World War, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Whilst Norway would hold out for another 2 months, Denmark surrendered immediately. This decision avoided any unnecessary death and destruction and allowed Denmark's sovereignty to remain intact.
Unlike German occupation policy elsewhere in Europe, at first their rule in Denmark was relatively benign. This was necessary because Denmark exported a lot of essential supplies to Germany, especially food. They also saw Danes as fellow proper Aryans. This model of occupation, or the model protectorate, meant that Denmark could keep its entire government, police and civil service. There were also minimal restrictions on ordinary people, unlike in the rest of Nazi-occupied Europe. This also applied to Denmark's almost 8,000 Jews, a tiny proportion of Denmark's population of 4 million people. Danish Jews were...
Yep, you see this with Denmark, you see this a bit in Norway as well, where there is this leniency from the Germans that they really don't show in other places. And they actually write about this that we've gotten, through personal letters and things of that sort since then, where they do see this weird sort of ethnic brotherhood that exists there. It's kind of a strange thing. But if you think of like the model child or person that they would model their whole society on, there's a fair few of them there. So I mean, you could kind of understand the logic that got them there. But it is kind of an interesting part of the occupation because it's just a very different attitude than it is in a lot of the other places.
Were very assimilated into Danish society, although there was still some anti-Semitism. King Christian X and the Danish government had made it known that they would continue to cooperate with Germany only so long as the Nazis did not introduce any anti-Jewish legislation. In fact, the king wrote in his diary that he, quote, considered our own Jews to be Danish citizens and the Germans could not touch them.
However, this policy of protection for the Jews would not last forever. In mid-1943, the relationship between the Danish people and its German occupiers began to change. As Germany suffered more and more military setbacks, the Danish population began to more actively resist German control. Demonstrations and mass strikes took place, and acts of sabotage by the Danish resistance intensified.
Yeah, they don't respond to that well. the German hierarchy, the German soldiers, they do not respond to this well. A big part of the war effort for the war in general was the French resistance. And France, specifically the French resistance, kind of went out of its way to do things that wasn't outright fighting the German soldier. And the reason for that is basically because of reprisals. Like, the response to these sorts of things was typically extremely harsh. Like, there are some examples that are, a German soldier is killed, and so they go to the nearest village and get, 100 males. There are some brutal examples of reprisals.
In August, the Danish government resigned and the German military commander declared martial law.
Over late August and September, there were a couple of incidents that sparked fear throughout the Danish Jewish population. In one incident, the premises belonging to the Jewish community were searched by the Gestapo for lists, indexes, books, family trees, anything that would help the Germans to identify Danish Jews, since, unlike in other countries, they had not been forced to register with authorities, made to wear a yellow star, or carry identity cards marked with the letter J.
Now that the Germans were no longer pursuing a policy of active cooperation, their rule became much more repressive. On September 8th,
I didn't know that they initially didn't have to have any of the typical insignias or identification or anything like that. I did not know that. I guess I just assumed that was the case.
the Nazi civil administrator in Denmark, Werner Best, wrote to Berlin suggesting a solution to the Jewish question must now be considered. A week later, Hitler issued the order, and preparations were made for the imminent deportation of Danish Jews. The Nazis planned to make the arrest on the night of October 1st. Crucially, this was after trade negotiations had been completed, which guaranteed Danish supplies to the Reich for the coming year. But it was also the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Fortunately, the Danish Jews were about to receive a life-saving warning. George Ferdinand de Quitz worked at the German embassy in Denmark and had been told of the plan by Werner Best. Upon hearing of the planned deportations, he tipped off a number of local politicians, one of whom alerted a prominent figure within the Jewish community. On the 29th of September 1943, at a service that marks the start of Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Marcus Melchior warned those present in the synagogue not to be at home over the next few days. This warning was passed on by both Jewish and non-Jewish Danish citizens and gave the Danish Jews a vital head start, allowing them time to pack a few belongings, go into hiding and make preparations to leave Denmark.
So, on the 1st of October, when German police and Danish SS volunteers knocked on the doors of Danish Jews, they found that the majority were not there. Unlike elsewhere in Western Europe, the Nazis were specifically ordered not to force their way into homes or damage property. This meant that the Germans were only able to make around 500 arrests. This included elderly Jews who had been unable to flee, and those in the provinces who hadn't been alerted to the danger. The other 7,000 Danish Jews were already in hiding, with friends, neighbours, sometimes even strangers, and preparing to flee to nearby Sweden.
Almost all of Denmark's Jews were concentrated in Copenhagen, just 20 miles away from Sweden, significantly reducing the time and risk required to escape. Now all they needed was a way to get to Sweden, which was separated from Denmark by a stretch of water called the Øresund. On the 2nd of October, Sweden formally broadcast a message offering to accept all Danish Jews and their non-Jewish relatives who could reach Sweden.
I know that, now looking back at it, that seems like a no-brainer. That seems like something that you would think, yeah, of course that's something Sweden would do. There weren't a ton of those countries. There were quite a few countries that, at least behind closed doors, were not particularly opening their arms for fleeing Jews from across Europe. So it's not as straightforward, and it's not as common as you would think it would be looking back today. But yeah, good for them.
This announcement gave the green light to those in hiding, who now knew they would be safe if they could find a way across the Øresund. But whilst the majority of Denmark's Jews began to plan their escape over to Sweden, Those that didn't make it into hiding in time began to be deported.
456 of the 476 Jews who had been arrested were transported to Germany. Then, mostly in cattle wagons, like the one behind me, were sent to the ghetto in Terezin, which the Nazis renamed Theresienstadt.
Theresienstadt is around 60 kilometers north of Prague in what was then Czechoslovakia. The ghetto was created initially for Czech Jews. Later, elderly Jews and those seen as privileged were sent there from Germany and Austria.
The Nazis would attempt to deceive the world that Jews in Theresienstadt could live a normal life, which led to the ghetto gaining some amenities which were quite unusual for a ghetto. For example, there was a bank in Theresienstadt which issued money and savings books. In reality, any money or savings were worthless. Cultural life also flourished. Artwork was produced, music was composed, operas were written and performed, and lectures were delivered, something that the Germans capitalised on for propaganda purposes.
The conditions the captured Danish Jews would experience upon their arrival in Theresienstadt were atrocious. Death rates were high in the ghetto, particularly amongst the elderly, who were especially vulnerable to the dire overcrowding, starvation, and disease. Back in Denmark, the majority of Danish Jews fled to coastal towns and ports in the Zealand. Local non-Jewish people offered shelter, and in some cases, they helped to secure transport on fishing boats. In the first week or so, before any organised help was coordinated, some Danish Jews sought local fishermen and skippers to take them across to Sweden. They would often request huge sums of money for the journey. This was mostly due to fears of being caught and losing their livelihood, though some simply saw an opportunity to make a profit. Within the first 48 hours, around 500 Jews had left Denmark and reached safety in Sweden, largely those who could afford these high prices. Resistance groups soon coordinated, and they organised transports across the Øresund. They negotiated standard fares and raised funds for those who did not have enough money to make the journey.
By the 9th of October, approximately 4,500 Jews from Denmark had reached Sweden, and by mid-October, around 7,200 had made it to safety, a total of 95% of Denmark's Jewish population. Part of the reason boats and ships were able to successfully cross the Øresund was because Danish and German coastal patrols did not intervene. In part, this was because Werner Best had one eye on maintaining a peaceful occupation and avoiding any increase in anti-German sentiment. But none of the Danish were aware of this. For the Danish Jews who were escaping and those helping them, the journey was full of fear, tension, and anxiety. Those who acted to help, assist in the rescue, did so boldly and in the face of the unknown.
Yeah, sure. You hear all of these horror stories at the time, like contemporaries of the time participating in this. You hear horror stories from all across Europe of what's happening to these people, what's happening to collaborators, that they're being treated as the same, basically. You hear about the response to resistance groups, and I'm sure there is no sort of thought process of like, it's different here. Why would it be? Why would it be different for Denmark than it would be anywhere else? So yeah, I'm sure that they went into it thinking that the consequences and the danger was just as high as it would be doing this, in France or in Italy or Czechoslovakia or, Poland, wherever else.
In November, it was agreed that the Jews who had been deported from Denmark would remain in Theresienstadt, and the Germans would also reluctantly allow the Danish Red Cross to conduct a visit and inspect the conditions of the ghetto, but made sure this visit wouldn't take place until after they'd had enough time to create a false narrative.
In the lead up to this visit, Theresienstadt underwent intense renovations in order to present the ghetto as a model Jewish settlement. This work was done by the prisoners, who were forced to build a swimming pool, plant gardens, construct parks, renovate barracks, and plan cultural events. Over 7,000 people were deported, primarily to Auschwitz-Birkenau, in the weeks before the Red Cross visit, so that the ghetto looked less overcrowded.
Danish prisoners were also temporarily moved to slightly better accommodation and were allowed to stay together as families. When they arrived, Red Cross officials were shown a performance of a children's opera and a football match. The work that had been done succeeded in fooling the Danish Red Cross officials, who reported that the conditions, health, clothing, and accommodation were satisfactory. In reality, over 30,000 Jews would die in Theresienstadt, and nearly 90,000 were deported to Nazi death camps, where they were murdered.
Not long after the visit, deportations resumed. Tens of thousands were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and their names recorded on transport lists. This transport list shows some of the names of the 2,503 men, women and children who were deported from Theresienstadt on the 18th of December 1943. They arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau the next day. Because of the agreement with the Germans, Danish Jews were not deported from the ghetto and remained in the ghetto until April 1945.
That was so bizarre. When you go to Ellis Island, they have these books there where people were like basically signing in, coming into the country. And it's really crazy because you see these swaths of names that are, you know, Polish and Irish and Italian, and you see all these things, and it's kind of a crazy feeling to stand there and read them, because now when you look back at that, you're like, these are people who came who now are generations, like generationally they are American and have been now, you know, for a long time. And it's a very bizarre feeling to stand there and read some of the names off. Seeing that thing with the book there gave me a super weird feeling where it's like it's almost the same thing, but just in an awful, like polar opposite way.
At which point the remaining Danish Jews were transported to Sweden by the Danish, Norwegian and Swedish Red Cross. After the liberation of Denmark in May 1945, most Jews were able to return to the homes that they had been forced to abandon in 1943.
51 Danish Jews died in Theresienstadt and a further 50 or so more died trying to escape to Sweden, or in Sweden itself. This number represents one of the lowest death rates of Jews in any German-occupied European country during the Second World War.
Over 95% of Danish Jews survived the Holocaust. It's an extraordinary statistic, made possible by Denmark's unique set of circumstances during the war. But this was the minority experience. 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population would not survive the Second World War.
Okay, so that's a very interesting story. If anybody else has any other videos that are like this, that are in this vein, I'd be very interested to see them. Stories like these are very intriguing to me. World War II and World War I, but you know, that 20th century time period is one that I really, really like. I study it a lot, read a lot about it, and you know, the danger that people went through and the sort of sacrifices that they made to try to make these things happen are just really, really incredible to me. So if anybody has any other videos or stories they want to share, please do. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. I'm sure this video is going to do terrible numbers because of the content and topic, but I felt like it was important and I really wanted to do it, so there it is. But yeah, I'll try to get out another video within the next day or two. Like I said, working on house stuff, trying to get it all done and then work on top of that. But I'm trying as hard as I can to put more time aside to do more videos, so I'll try to stay on top of it. With all that said, I'll see you all next time.